And now it is really a great pleasure to introduce to you our featured scholar for this evening. Dr. Sarit Kattan Gribetz is an associate professor in the theology department at Fordham University. Her areas of research and teaching include rabbinic literature, the history of Jews in the Roman Empire, the city of Jerusalem, conceptions of time and timekeeping, and gender and sexuality. She received her PhD from the religion department at Princeton University, studied Talmud and archaeology at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem as a Fulbright Fellow, and served as a research fellow at the Israel Institute for Advanced Study and the Einstein Center Kronoi in Berlin. Currently, she is researching the gendered history of Jerusalem, a topic that has generated two projects. The first, about which she will be speaking tomorrow at noon on campus in Nicholson Hall, studies the life and legacy of the first century queen Helena of Adiabene, a royal figure from northern Mesopotamia, whose time in Jerusalem is discussed prominently in the writings of Josephus Flavius, in rabbinic texts, early Christian writings, and in medieval sources, and whose modern reception, as I think we'll hear tomorrow, she argues is just as fascinating as the ancient. The second project is titled Jerusalem, a Feminist History, and it seeks to retell the entire history of Jerusalem from the earliest archaeological sources to the contemporary, with a focus on the city's women and from a feminist historical lens. Publication of her scholarship on these topics is eagerly anticipated, considering that her book, Time and Difference in Rabbinic Judaism, published by Princeton University Press in 2020, received a National Jewish Book Award for scholarship. And if this were not enough, she is also writing on a set of satirical Jewish texts from the medieval period called Toldot Yeshu, which tell the story of Jesus' life from a Jewish and anti-Christian perspective, and which she uses to investigate the use of parody in religious polemic. In addition, and really I don't know when you sleep, she has co-edited several volumes on Jewish and Christian antiquity, including Rabbis and Others in Conversation, out in 2012, Jewish and Christian Cosmogony in Late Antiquity, 2013, and Genesis Rabbah in Text and Context, out in 2016, as well as articles about the reception of Talmudic texts in South Korea, the intersection of gender and ancient textual transmission, travel practices, conceptions of holiness, and essays about pedagogy. Please join me in welcoming Sarit Kattan.
Thank you, first of all, to the University of Minnesota Center for Jewish Studies for hosting, or for inviting me to speak today, Rabbi Davis and Bethel Synagogue for hosting us, Natan Paradise for welcoming me so warmly, to Marielle and to Liz for everything that they did logistically to make tonight's event possible, sponsors and all of you for your warm welcome and enthusiasm. I'm excited and honored to be here and to spend this time with you, especially on a night when you could be at an exhibit opening and at a concert and all sorts of other activities. And maybe after tonight, you'll also get some tips on how to multitask and be at more than one place at the same time. But for now, you're stuck with me. Speaking of time, have you ever wondered what goes on at this hour in the heavens? In their book, The Daily Life of the Greek Gods, Julia Sisa and Marcel Detienne write about the questions that Cicero and Lucian and Seneca and many other ancient Roman writers and philosophers asked about their gods. And this is a quote: "What do they do? Or more to the point, do they do anything at all? For, as Cicero remarks, much is said about what they look like and the places where they live, and about their houses and the exploits of their lives. But the question that above all underlies any difference of opinion as to their nature is whether or not they do anything, they meddle in anything, abstain from all concern and all cares. Whatever would one do with carefree and passive gods of leisure? The question of their activity was the touchstone for their presence in the world." The stakes to answers about how gods organize and use their time are enormous. And this topic interested the ancient rabbis for the same reason that it occupied others in the ancient world. Rabbis sought to understand how do their gods relate to human beings and the world that they inhabit. How do their gods' actions impinge upon human existence, and whether their god's existence matters at all for those who dwell on earth. So imagining how God's time is divided and what God does during each hour of each day allowed the rabbis to grapple with a question of what distinguishes divine from human, and also to differentiate themselves from those around them who had different theological ideas on these very topics. I recently published a book about what you heard, Time and Difference in Rabbinic Judaism, which examines conceptions and organizations of time in rabbinic sources, so sources composed from the about 200 to 600 CE, both in Palestine and in Babylonia, but that have had lasting influence on Jewish communities and Jewish communal life thereafter. And the underlying contention of the book is that time is culturally constructed, historically contingent, and disciplinarily specific. So in other words, the very basic assumptions that we make about time are neither natural nor universal, right? They're products of the societies and the communities in which we live, even when they seem to us to be natural or biological, because they're bound up with natural processes such as the rising and setting of the sun, the waning and waxing of the moon, the changing of the seasons, the aging of our bodies, and other processes that are in fact natural, astronomical, and so on. We map our own ideas about time onto those processes. And so units of time, like years and months and weeks and days and hours, and how we experience those units of time are constructed. And so the way that we use and divide time isn't arbitrary. It's some sort of reflection of our values or of the values of the communities and the societies in which we find ourselves. So in my book, I argue that rabbis and the writings that they preserved in the Mishnah, the Talmud, and so on, use timekeeping and discourses about time to construct social, political, cultural, religious difference in all sorts of realms of life. And I looked at 4 of them. So the way that Rabbinic and Roman time distinguished what it meant to be a rabbi, what it meant to be Roman, distinctions between Jews and Christians, between men and women, and also between the human and divine, including God and the angels. And the argument of the book, if I had to summarize it in one sentence, is that time serves as a powerful mechanism to enact difference and forge identity. Right? Time is not just something that passes, but time is also a tool. We use time to do all sorts of things, and one of the things that we do with time is that we use the way we organize time and the way we spend our time to create our own communities and also to distinguish our communities from other communities. So that's the big argument. And what I want to do today with you is to explore rabbinic conceptions of divine time in particular, right? Specifically the question of what ancient Jewish sources imagine God's daily schedule and God's nightlife. And so as we'll see in a moment, the texts take for granted that God exists in time and that God is a very accurate keeper of time and that God is very punctual. So that's like the assumption, okay? But then they have all sorts of questions. How does God spend time? What does God do with so many hours in each day, right? If you think about it, they wonder, like, God was really busy during creation, but what has God been doing since creation? And through thinking about how the rabbis imagined God's time, hopefully by the end we'll be able to unpack some of the ways in which the rabbis thought about the divine and also conceptualized what it meant to be human and what it meant to be divine and what distinguishes between human and divine. So the question of whether God exists in time, how divine time relates to human time, animated the theological work of many people in the ancient world. And one of those sources that we have is the writings of the first century Jewish philosopher, bless you, Philo of Alexandria, who argued in his treatise on the creation of the world that in contrast to people and all other created beings, God exists outside of time, right? So this is a timeless aspect of God, and that it's a central feature of what distinguishes between divine and human, right? So for Philo, time was created simultaneously with material creation. Time didn't pre-exist matter, right? And so God is presented as both atemporal, eternal, and all the created world is temporal, right? It exists in time, and it's temporally bound. And so in this account, right, Philo argues not only that God is atemporal, but that to be divine, like to be God, is to be atemporal, and to be created is to be temporally bound. And so for Philo, the distinction between what it means to be human and what it means to be divine is also a question about time, right? So time distinguishes or defines the difference between human and divine. So in light of these ancient sources, it's striking, as we'll see in a moment, that rabbinic texts take a very different approach to the differences and similarities between human and divine time, because humans and God exist in the same time, right? They both exist in time. God is not atemporal in rabbinic sources. God and humans both exist in time and in the very same time. So I want to look together with you at a number of sources. They're playful sources, so I hope we'll have fun, that provide narratives both from Midrashim and from the Talmudim, and also from sort of rabbinic adjacent texts, the Targumim, Aramaic translations of the Bible, and Piyutim, liturgical poetry, that reflect on God's time and provide texture to how we might imagine God's days and nights. So they give us a little bit of an opportunity also to think about how we make our own decisions about how we organize and use our time, by also reflecting on how the rabbis thought about God's temporal decisions. So we're going to look at a number of sets of sources in different categories. So the first is a question about how the rabbis thought about God's timeliness, right? God exists in time, and also God is very precise at timekeeping. The second is wondering what God did during each hour of the sixth day of creation, right? When God was creating the world, what did that look like? In the third set, we're going to wonder, what has God been doing since creation? And then we're going to ask the very specific question of, what is God's daily schedule? And then we'll take a little bit of a detour to wonder, like, if God has such a strict daily schedule, is there any room in God's schedule for spontaneity and for emotions and for feeling sad and happy and crying and laughing and mourning and so on? And then at the end, we'll turn to God's nightlife. So that's the plan. So part one, God's time. So the first source that I want to show you is 3 biblical passages, all from the book of Exodus. And what you'll notice in these sources, they're all about the night of the Exodus, when the Israelites are leaving Egypt at midnight. And what we have in the text, and this so often happens in rabbinic sources, is that there are small discrepancies in the texts that the rabbis try to understand. And the discrepancy is as follows. When Moses tells the people of Israel that God is going to take them out of Egypt, he uses the words kechatzi halayla, around midnight. God will take you out of Egypt around midnight, right? It's an estimate. In the second line, when God tells Moses that God's going to take Israel out of Egypt, God just says, balayla hazeh, that night, without being very specific about the time. And when the biblical text narrates the exodus from Egypt, the biblical text says b'chatzi halayla, at midnight. And the rabbis wonder, was it around midnight? Was it that night? Was it exactly at midnight? How do we understand the difference? And one of the explanations that they give is that the discrepancy is not arbitrary, right? Biblical scholars might say it's actually probably a scribal error. B'chatzi halayla looks a lot like kachatzi halayla. But setting that aside, right, the rabbis are trying to understand what the difference is, and they say, well, that's because divine and human time is not exactly the same. God can be very precise about timekeeping, and so God can actually enact the Exodus at midnight, right? How can you actually do something exactly in the middle of the night, right? The point between the start and the end of the night, unless you're God. What was the other problem that the Israelites had when they miscalculated time? Right, Moses goes up the mount of, up the mountain and doesn't come back because the Israelites miscalculated the time, and within a day they build the golden calf, right? So the Midrash has this sort of temporal mishap in its mind, and it says when Moses told the people when God was going to take them out of Egypt, he was like around midnight, so that they wouldn't miscalculate and then expect that God wasn't going to take them out. And this is what the text, the Midrash, says. And it came to pass at midnight, the creator of night divided it exactly, right? Chalko. Why, right? So it says about midnight. And so why did Moses give an imprecise time if it was going to happen at midnight? And the answer is it possible for a human being to fix the exact time of midnight? None but the creator could have divided the night exactly. Rabbi Joshua ben Betera says, he who knows its hours and its fractions divided it, right? God created the world and God created time and the divisions of time. God can do it exactly. And then they continue, right? So here we have this idea, right? We can explain the biblical text in a better way because we know that God is a very precise timekeeper. We have another instance in rabbinic sources where God is imagined as being a very accurate timekeeper, and that is in the story of creation. I have a very peculiar passage in Genesis 2:2. It's the end of the week of creation, and God is stopping to work and starting to rest. And the passage in Genesis 2:2 doesn't make any sense, right? It says that God finished the work that God had done, right, vayachal, and also rested, vayishbot, on the seventh day. And the rabbis wonder, how could God have finished the work and rested on the same day? Those are contradictory actions. And what is their answer? So in the 5th century Midrash Genesis Rabbah, the answer is, again, that God is very precise with time. They say there's a tradition, right? What's the meaning that God both finished the work of creation and also rested on the seventh day? It is like this. God strikes with a hammer on the anvil, right? So if we imagine the image of God creating the world, here Genesis Rabbah is imagining God as a blacksmith, right? Or someone who is a builder. And for those of you who have studied Hilchot Shabbat, know that the last of the 39 labors that are prohibited on the Sabbath is makebet patish, to literally finish a work by using a hammer to finish, right? The last thing that you do to finish something. So here, what is God doing? God is finishing the work of creation right before the Sabbath starts. And the Midrash explains, he raises it while it is still day. So God raises this hammer when it is still day and brings it down as it becomes dark. Human beings, flesh and blood, don't know the regaim and the itim and the sha'ot. Like, they don't know the precise divisions of time. And so those people have to start the Sabbath a little bit earlier, right, as the sun sets. And that's why we begin officially the Sabbath, right, not at nightfall, but some number of minutes before. But God, right, God knows the regaim and the itim and the sha'ot, and therefore God can enter Shabbat kechut ha'se'ara, like a strand of hair, right? So God can both work and finish that work on the Sabbath, and also can rest on the Sabbath. There's a whole tradition in rabbinic texts about the things that God created, ben hashmashot, twilight, before the start of Sabbath, right? And these are all these mystical, interesting sort of trans-temporal creations that appear in multiple historical periods. Those are created in the moment of twilight, in this time when human beings have to stop working, but God is allowed to rest. Okay, so now we know God is very punctual. And so the question is, how did God use time during this last day of creation before God uses the hammer on the anvil? To answer this question, we have to turn to a rabbinic tradition about Rosh Hashanah, about the new year. We read in Leviticus that there is a holiday on the first day of the 7th month, and the rabbis want to know what happened on the first day of the 7th month, which we now know as the first of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, that it was a holiday. And it's interesting because the biblical sources don't really tell us, right? So it's a question that they have. And they answer with a beautiful midrash. They say, well, actually, it's the day on which human beings were created, right? So Rosh Hashanah is the day on which humans are created. Rosh Hashanah is also the day where we think about the year, we pray for a good year, if we do teshuvah, we repent, right? There are all sorts of things that happen on that day. The rabbis are thinking to themselves, and so they say it's actually the day, and we'll see that humans were created, but also that humans were judged, right? So it's a day where they tie it all together. And here we have God's schedule for the 6th day of creation, and I want you to imagine this as sort of like they're publishing God's schedule, or they're doing some sort of like storyboard of God's day, and this is what we read. In the text. So on the first day, Adam was created. In the first hour of that day, God has the idea, right? The idea occurred to God that God should create a human being. And in the second, God consults with the angels, right? So it's combining many different traditions from antiquity, both that in order to create something, you first have the idea and then you create something. The second is that God wasn't sure if creating humans was a good idea, right? We could imagine why it might be a bad idea to create humans. And the angels actually are like, yeah, don't do it, right? There are all these reasons why creating humans it's gonna make a lot of trouble, and God ignores the angels and sort of turns away and sort of secretly makes the human beings. So those are God's first 2 hours, right? The conception of humans. In the third, God gathers Adam's dust. In the fourth, God kneads that dust. In the fifth, forms the limbs. And the verb that's used is associated with the formation of limbs in an embryo, right? So this is a really early stage. In the sixth, God makes a lifeless body, a golem. So in those 4 hours, God is making the physical body, right? So in the first half of that day, in the first 6 hours, God's thinking about creating humans, and God creates the body. And then in the 7th hour, God breathes a soul into Adam. In the 8th, brings Adam to the garden. And here, the subject changes. So we go from God and how God spent those first 8 hours, to now Adam is the subject, the verbal subject in this midrash. In the 9th, he, meaning Adam, was commanded, right, not to eat from the forbidden tree. In the 10th, Adam transgressed, right, ate from the apple, or whatever, the fruit. In the 11th, was judged, and in the 12th, was pardoned. So this is sort of a whole life of a human being in one day, right? From conception to the body, the soul acting, sinning, repenting, and transgressing. If we imagine this in terms of what it tells us about the relationship between human and divine, right? God is connected to humanity from the very first hour that humans are created. And it's not only just a very removed interaction, but God is really present there, right? In thought, in body, in soul, and so on, every hour since the creation of human beings, right? So that's the first thing. The second is that this story imagines Adam as the only creation of the sixth day, right? There are other beings that are created. So even if we imagine this Adam as being like the androgynous Adam, right? Like humanity in general, like the Eve and the Adam together, right? There are animals that are created on the sixth day, but here God has only human beings as the center of attention, right? So it's not only that every hour is spent, but every hour is spent only on human beings. And then also we have this sense that this is a day, it's a hopeful story, right? Human beings sinned, they actually here, right? Adam sins like right away after being created, but God also accepts the repentance, right? And so what we have is this sort of celebration of the creation of humans, and also the fate of humanity is established on the first day of humans' creation. Okay, so now we have God's schedule. This schedule gets incorporated in all sorts of texts. So here, for example, is a piyut, a liturgical poem by the 7th century liturgical poet Yanai, who mentions the hours of creation, but not in the context of Rosh Hashanah, but in the context of the weekly cycle of it's for Shabbat, right? So the idea is that every Friday is also the day in which human beings were created, and what is the lead up to Shabbat, right? Instead of this time when God is creating these magical creations right before Shabbat starts, this is a time when Adam is repenting and God is accepting that repentance and forgiving, right? And so there's this aspect of sort of a weekly creation and forgiveness. So not all versions of this story are quite as positive and happy as the one that we saw that was originally, comes from probably Leviticus Rabbah or Psikta Rav Kahana, which comment on this text, comments on either explaining where Rosh Hashanah comes from or in a homily for Rosh Hashanah. We have a different tradition from the Babylonian Talmud that tells a little bit of a more depressing story version of this. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but what you'll see is, right, again, we have a 12-hour day of God's creation of humans. So God gathers the dust. So first of all, this is not a contemplative God in the same way. Kneads Adam into a shapeless mass, makes the limbs, infuses the body with the soul, stands Adam up, and then, Adam stands up, and then Adam gives names to the animals, right? So all of a sudden, Adam is participating in a different way. Then Eve is created. Then they ascend to bed as 2, and they emerge from the bed as 4, right? They have children in the 8th hour. Then Adam is commanded not to eat. Then Adam sins. Adam is put on trial, and Adam is exiled from the Garden of Eden, right? This is a very different conception of the relationship between humans and the divine. They are intertwined. God is caring for Adam, except for at the end, the story doesn't end with repentance. The story ends with exile. And we see this as well in a version in Pirkei de Rabbi Eliezer, which is another later midrash, right? So we have these two sort of versions of what happens on the 6th day of creation. But I bet you're wondering, okay, we know exactly what God did in the 6th day of creation. What has God been doing since then? And this is a story, a question that a particular woman in the rabbinic text poses to a rabbi. She's called Matrona in the text, some sort of Roman elite woman in this text. She comes with ideas that are very stereotypical of Roman creationist sort of philosophy and theology. So here is what she says. She comes to Rabbi Yossi ben Chalufta and she says, how many days did it take God to create the world? And he says, 6. And she says, okay, since then, what does God do, right? What has been taking up God's time? And the rabbi says, well, God is very occupied in God's work of matchmaking, right? God's sitting and thinking, well, I'm going to match this person with this person and this person with this person. And Matrona is not impressed, okay? She says, I enslave lots of people. I have maidservants. She says, bisha'a kala, in a simple hour, right? Like in barely an hour, I could match all of them up. And that's, in fact, what she does, right? She goes home, she matches all of her, all the people in her household, she matches them up. And you can imagine that that is not a successful way to make matches between people. And the next morning they come and they're bruised, they're angry, they're traumatized, and she realizes that actually matchmaking is a hard job. And she returns to the rabbi, right? And they come and tell her, right? I don't want to be with him. I don't want to be with her. Please separate us from one another. And this leads her to say, good is your Torah, beautiful and praiseworthy, right? She understands the words that the rabbi originally told her, which is, it might be easy for you to make matches, but for God, it's as hard as splitting the sea, right? And she acknowledges this at the end of the story. It's actually a really cool analogy, because splitting the sea is really separating things that ought to be together, right? The seas that are impossible to split, and here, sort of splitting things that are that are unsplittable is as hard as matching things that are separate, right? So that is what God has been doing since creation, and now we can go home. Except for that it's a little more complicated, because we have a whole other set of rabbinic sources and traditions that have a different version of what God does all day, in which making matches is one part of the job, but is not the whole job. And so I want to look at those sources for a few minutes. So what is God doing every day if God is not only making matches? So the first source that I want to look at is actually from an early Targum, a translation of the biblical text into Aramaic. And it's a Targum on a particular verse that says that God's work is perfect, right? And so the question that the Targum is asking is, what work, right? Tamim pa'alo, like God's work is perfect. What does God's work entail? And it describes that when Moses went up to Mount Sinai, Moses got a really good look at God's schedule. And it's not only that God's work was perfect, but God's work schedule was perfect. And so Moses the prophet said, when I ascended the mountain, I saw the Lord of all the world divide the day into 4 parts, right? So there are 12 hours in a day, so 3-hour segments. 3 hours, God studies Torah. 3 hours, God judges the world. 3 hours, God provides or sustains the world. And 3 hours, God matches between men and women. I love this Aramaic verb, mizavig. There are all sorts of variations of it, but it's literally to make matches, to make zugot. So now we know, right? This is God's daily schedule. The Targum was a text that was recited in the synagogue, right? So this wasn't a text that remained in the academic study house. This was a text that would have been read in a space sort of like this one, right? In a communal space. It's also a tradition that we see in ritual contexts as well. And so this poem, which I realize is a little bit challenging to read, but I'll read some of it to you, is an Aramaic poem. We don't know when it would have been recited, but scholars assume that it could have been part of a wedding ceremony or a wedding celebration, or in the celebration of weddings in the days after, maybe a Shabbat after a wedding celebration. And here, what we have is a poem that says, God has a very clear schedule. So it starts, the Ancient of Days is seen in the high heavens. He divides the day into 4 quarters in his wisdom. And we have the same exact division, right? Torah, judgment, sustaining. And then God spends the last 3 hours of every day making matches. And the message to the couple that's celebrating their wedding is that they're a match made in heaven, right? And not only are they made in heaven, but God matched them up when they were still embryos, right? So when you imagine God forming the embryo, the limbs of the embryo in the sixth day of creation for the first human, here God is not only creating every human in the womb, but also matching them up already, right? So it's like, no pressure, guys. You're getting married, but like, you should just know God spent a lot of time on this, right? And then it's basically both celebrating their union, but also sort of coaxing them to do what's right. One thing that this poem sort of evokes is that if you think about what God did during creation, right, was not only create beings of all kinds, but often, right, we hear about the pairs, right? So one of the things that God does in the first week of creation is not only creating beings, but also creating pairs. And we see that most, like the emphasis on Adam and Eve, right? So God creates Adam, and then God's like, it's not good to be alone, right? Let me create a pair for you. And so from the first creation of the first human, God is already acting as matchmaker. It makes sense that God is acting as matchmaker also every day after creation. It's sort of like an ongoing creation. We have Midrashim in Genesis Rabbah and other sources that describe God adorning Eve, braiding her hair, sort of prepping her, like really being the shadchan, prepping her before she meets Adam, right? And so here we have this in a liturgical poem. Another version, and probably the most well-known version of this daily schedule, appears in the Babylonian Talmud, but here we get a slightly different schedule. And it's worth dwelling on this for a moment. So in the Babylonian Talmud, this is found in Tractate Avodah Zarah, which is a tractate about how Jews ought to relate to the worship of other people around them. And it's in a story about the eschatological future, what will happen specifically on the holiday of Sukkot in the end times. But the Talmud, as it often does, sort of takes a tangent in a different direction, and it wonders what God does in the 12 hours of each day. And so it begins in a way that's very similar to all of the Palestinian traditions that we just saw in the Targum and in the poem. And it says, during the first hour of every day, God studies Torah. In the second, God sits in judgment over the whole world. But of course, going back to that conversation that God had with the angels about whether God should create human beings, it turns out God shouldn't have created human beings if it was only based on whether it was sound judgment. And so God needs to move from the seat of judgment to the seat of mercy, have mercy on the people, not destroy them in that period of time. And so we see sort of in the second period of God's day, God is not only judging, but God is also having mercy. Then in the third quarter, God is feeding the whole world, and here, right, the emphasis is not on humans, right? So God is sustaining all of the creatures, right, from the very biggest to the tiniest. And then in the fourth quarter, God is, the verb is lisachek, with the Leviathan. So God is either playing or laughing, hanging out. It can have like erotic connotations as well, but God is having a good time with Leviathan. So the question is like, what's Leviathan doing in here, right? This used to be a tradition about God making matches. So let me explain. So the Leviathan, first of all, is associated with the primordial past, right? From the very, like the pre-creation, Leviathan's a sea monster, and so in some rabbinic traditions, Leviathan is also created ben hashmashot, in that period right before Shabbat starts, right? So Leviathan is associated with the very early moments of creation. Leviathan is also associated with the eschatological future for many reasons, but one reason is that there's a rabbinic tradition that says that God created a female and a male Leviathan at the beginning of in creation. But what happens when Leviathans, there are male and female Leviathans? There are going to be numerous Leviathans, and they're going to take over the whole world, and it's going to be a disaster, right? That's at least what God thought. And this rabbinic tradition says that God, therefore, kills the female Leviathan, pickles her, puts her in a jar, and saves her for the eschatological feast at the end of time. I think Freud would have a blast with this midrash, actually. But, right, so what do we have? We have male Leviathan still alive. We have female Leviathan waiting for the end of days. And the only two beings that don't have a partner in this entire universe are God and Leviathan. And they don't have much to do because the work of creation is over and the eschatological era hasn't yet started. And so God and Leviathan hang out together, right? They become partners, right? There's this combat and lovers, or some sort of relationship that they're cultivating, and that's also associated with this leisure time activity. There's a problem, though. I can imagine that these rabbis were like, but the destruction happened, and we thought that God's not having a good time anymore. And so the rabbis are like, yes, that's true. God used to hang out with the Leviathan, and now God actually had to change God's schedule because God doesn't laugh, right? Doesn't lisachek anymore, and instead is teaching the children in heaven. It's interesting, actually, right? So God is not lisachek, like the word that's also might be associated with children, but rather teaching them. And then the story goes on, but we're going to stop there. So this is a Babylonian tradition. I want to share one more way in which this schedule of God is used in rabbinic sources, and that's for a pedagogical reason. So in Tana Debei Eliyahu Rabbah, what we get is God is very proud of the way that God spends every hour of every day. So the midrash says, Yishmor Adam et atzmo shelo yirbeh schok, sicha v'tiflut. So a person should make sure not to engage in too much leisure activity, in idle talk, and in nonsense, right? So schok here is translated as leisure, but it's this word that's used with the Leviathan. Sicha is like conversations that don't mean anything, and tiflut is often a word in rabbinic sources that's associated both with sort of like a bad waste of time, but also with sort of promiscuous activities, right? So you shouldn't spend your time doing these things. And you shouldn't do that, and God is the proof, because God actually doesn't really do any of that. And it says that God says, right, I sat for 974 generations before the world was created, and since then, until that very hour, I studied, I parsed, I analyzed the Torah. And then I sat on my throne. A third of the day I study Torah. A third I judge the world. A third I do chesed, charitable acts. I feed the world and so on. And I only engage in leisure, in schok, for a single hour, right? So here God is saying, I didn't allow myself to do these things that I consider to be a waste of time, except for at the very end of the day. And then the Midrash continues and says, when you come to heaven, right, when every person dies and has to confront God, God's going to say, here's my schedule, let me see yours. And you better not tell God that you had more than 1 hour of leisure in your day, right? So I'm not recommending this as a way of life. I'm just sharing the rabbinic source. But here, right, it's not only sort of imagining God's relationship with humans as sort of caring for humans every hour of the day, but also holding humans accountable for how they spend their time in relation to God. More briefly, I want to share with you just a couple of examples of the way in which, even though God has a really set schedule, God also can be spontaneous. And so the first source is that God is angry, or God can get angry. And what the rabbinic source tells us is that God is angry every day. God is angry only for a split second every day. God is probably only angry in the first 3 hours of the day, and there are all sorts of explanations given, including that God sees other people worshiping the sun in one direction and is a little bit pissed off that they're not praying towards God, but that the split second that God is angry is unpredictable, right? And so what we get is God is able to express emotion, the emotion of anger, and God is not an angry God, right? It's just a split second, a rega, but humans can't anticipate when that anger will manifest itself, and so they have to be on their best behavior all the time, right? So you get the fear of God without an angry God, in a way. So that's one, right? 1 second of every day, God is angry. In a famous story that is often referred to as the oven of Achnai, which we won't recount in full, but the rabbis have a blast in the study house, basically saying that it doesn't matter what God thinks about halakha, what matters is what the rabbis think about halakha, and one rabbi is not happy with this, and the rabbis explain to him, lo bashamayim hi, it's not in the heavens, the halakha is here in the study house. And Elijah is wondering what God is doing at that time, in that hour, like in that sha'ah. And Elijah asks God, and God is laughing, right? Smiling, sorry, chiyech. Right, so God is not only angry, but also God can smile simultaneously with what's happening on earth, right? And so God can react to human action spontaneously and in the moment. Another source that we have describes that God cries every night, every end of every nightly watch in mourning of the temple. So not only can God smile or be angry, but God can also be very mournful every night over the destruction that the Jews face. And then also God wears tefillin, phylacteries, every day. This is right, it's a time-bound commandment. It's associated with a daily practice. And whereas Israel's tefillin, right, the Jewish tefillin, say they're about the devotion of Israel to God, God's tefillin describe God's love of humanity, right? So every day God engages in this practice of declaring God's love for the people of Israel. And then finally, we have another source here that describes how God is an excellent multitasker, right? So whereas humans can only do one thing at a time and be at one place at the same time, they say God has all these attributes, right? God can make war, God can teach children, God can be a scribe, a sofer, and so they also sort of imagine as God being not only omnipresent, but sort of omnitemporal, right? To be everywhere and every when at the same time. And finally, and here we're coming to a close, what is God doing at night? And I'm happy to report that the rabbis are not sure what God does at night. So there's this certainty about what God does at every hour of every day, and yet they're also willing to acknowledge that what God does at night is a little bit more mysterious. So they say, well, maybe God does the same thing at night as during the day. Or maybe God is traversing through the heavens with the angels and he's listening to prayers and so on. And so we get glimpses of what God does at night, but they're really subtle. What we do finally learn in Hechalot Rabbati, which is a mystical text, is that God listens to prayers all day long from the angels, but the first prayer of the day is reserved for the people of Israel, and God tells the angels to like hold off for a little bit because the humans come first, right? So we have this not only God and humans, but also the angels in the mix throughout these stories, navigating between God's time and human time. So where does this all leave us? So the first is that God and humans reckon time in the same way, right? They have the same years and weeks and hours and days. And this is a way of bringing God and humanity together, but also a way of keeping them somewhat apart because one is a much better timekeeper and time organizer than the other. The second is that these traditions appear throughout the rabbinic corpus, right? We saw sources from Babylonia, from Palestine. We saw them in rabbinic sources, in Midrashim, in the Talmudim, Piyutim, Targumim. We get a sense that these are very widespread traditions. They aren't, we might think of them as esoteric traditions, but in fact they were part of communal life and widely circulated. And people often, at least scholars, imagine that theological questions are really tangential to rabbinic thought, and that might in fact be true, but if theological questions weren't at the heart of the rabbinic project, they were at the heart of the intersection between the rabbinic project and popular piety, and we see that in these traditions in particular. And so, for example, if we think about communal life and sort of the spaces in which these traditions were shared and taught, one of the examples is to remember that synagogues in the 4th through 6th centuries in this region had Helios, had the sun god right in the middle of the synagogue. Helios is not only this annual, the seasonal cycles, but the sun also is a timekeeper for hours during the day. And often is depicted also with the moon and the stars, and the constellations and how they travel across the sky was how hours were determined in antiquity during the nighttime. And so these traditions would have been very much in dialogue with the spaces in which they were shared. God does a lot of human activities, right? God sits and studies and worships and weeps and plays. So they're very human activities, but at a scale that is divine. But a few activities God mirrors humans most closely, and those are activities that Jews in particular and Jewish men in these sources in particular do, such as laying phylacteries, right? So God, in a way, cares for all of humanity. God also does things that humans do, but God mirrors and has the closest relationship to the people of Israel as these sources imagine it. God also, and with this I'll conclude, God doesn't only, we don't only learn what God does each day, but also how God divides each day, and that's through hours. And so when the rabbis are imagining God's time, they're imagining that God is using this new technology of hours, which was something that was around but was associated mainly with realms of expertise, whether it was medical expertise, technological expertise, and also with the Roman emperor. And so God was sort of flexing by using these hours that were associated with power and prestige, but also the hour is the unit of time that people were connecting or sort of synchronizing their time with God. And when we think about rabbinic sources, so many of them, including the very first rabbinic passage in the Mishnah, is so concerned with how to make sure that that people who want to recite the Shema, who want to pray every day, do it at the right time. And part of it is because they're thinking about God and God's time and how humans can express and have a relationship with God, and part of that is making sure to time that well. And I just want to conclude by saying that the question of what God does is fundamentally a question about how the world operates, right? Is there a divinity keeping order and watching over the world? It's a question that's as much about the world and about God as it is about time. And so what we looked at today, they're like funny, weird, playful, quirky sources, and they seem in a way tangential to how we understand ancient Jewish communities, but I think that beneath that whimsical surface, they're also surprisingly insightful. They give us a little bit of a window into theological ideas about how the world operates, God's place in the world, and how the divine and the human intersect. So thank you.
Thank you very much. So we have time for questions.
I'm happy to answer questions, and I'm also happy if anyone needs to leave because they're tired to not feel any pressure to stay until the end. Yeah.
Thank you. This was really delightful. And I'm wondering, at the beginning, I got this sense that, as you said, God and humans share a kind of synchronous time in the rabbinic imagination, unlike, say, Philo, where God exists completely outside of time. And it seems to me that there is actually a third option, which is God exists in time, but that time is not synchronized with human time. And I'm wondering if the rabbis ever play with that idea. I'm thinking in particular of the verse from Tehillim, where it says, Elef shanim b'einecha k'yom etzmo. Like 1,000 years for us is like a day for you. So is there a sense that maybe God's time is mismatched with human time in some way?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think the answer is yes to both of them, right? So they're imagining both that God is on the same schedule, and also that God's time is almost unimaginably expansive, which is what I think the verse that you're talking about refers to. One example, for example, is whether God sleeps, right? Lo yanum velo yishan, right? God doesn't sleep, and that's something. Does God rest? Is that just a metaphor? And of course, that's not exactly about time, but it is also, right? Does God just go in cycles without needing to rest? And what are the implications for God's time? And the source about the night and what God does at night hints a little bit at that, because they're well, maybe God does the same thing as during the day. But I think that you're absolutely right. And there are certain sources which it's not only that God is more precise or can be precise with time in a way that humans can't, but also there's this expansiveness to God's time that is hard to fathom. We see it also with multitasking, right? That God can be in multiple sort of time zones at once. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think you may have alluded to this at the beginning. I'm probably going to see if we can draw that out at all. But how much might these traditions, these rabbinic traditions, reflect interactions with non-Jewish neighbors, so Christians or Greek and Roman religions, or any of the others that existed at the time?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I left this out of the talk because otherwise we'd be here for another hour. But I'll give you, I think, one example, which is in the sixth day of creation, when we get the hour-by-hour creation of human beings. That is remarkably similar to a Syriac text called the Cave of Treasures, which describes both the crucifixion of Jesus and also the resurrection and ascension. And we get the hour by hour again, and right, so it's the idea is the creation of Adam and then the crucifixion and the resurrection of Adam happen. They both happen on Fridays, right? Sorry, the creation of Adam and the crucifixion of Jesus, who is the second Adam, both happen on Fridays, and the hours are completely synchronized, right? So we get when this happened to Adam on the first week of creation, now this is happening to Jesus, and it's really sort of imagining the whole cycle of Adam as being reenacted by Jesus. And there's one way in which we can read the text about the creation of Adam in the rabbinic sources as offering an alternative. We don't need Jesus because Adam was already sinned and was forgiven on the sixth day of creation. And so it's sort of like an answer to that problem that Adam sinned, and then it was sort of resolved with Jesus. So that's one example. There are others. So for example, the story of Matrona, and that God is creating matches. So there's one critique, which is Roman creationism, right? This idea that God creates the world, but that God doesn't need like an active hand in the daily operations. The story answers that. But the story also, I think, offers a different perspective on the centrality of marriage and what it like, right? If God is creating all of these matches, then maybe celibacy and asceticism is not the highest form of connecting to God, that God is already sort of implicated in every human relationship. So those are a few examples. But I think the sort of the whole project could be retold as sort of rabbis thinking about God's time sort of in relationship and contrast also to the people around whom they're living, or with whom they're living.
If I could follow up with a related question, you used both Babylonian and Palestinian sources. Are there patterns of difference in those sources that reflect those different contexts?
Yeah, so that's a great question to which I have less of a good response. So there are differences, right? So we have these two different conceptions of the sixth day of creation, with the repentance in Palestine and the exile in Babylonia. You could match that, for example, to certain trends that I'm not, like a darker theology in a way. In terms of sort of thinking specifically about the Sasanian context, the Zoroastrian context of the Babylonian Talmud, I'm sure we could do that, but I don't have a good answer to that question, at least not right now. What I will say, though, is that hours meant something different in the sort of greater Roman Empire than they did in the Sasanian Empire. And so you do see, and Lynn Kay, for example, in her book on time in the Babylonian Talmud, highlights this difference in rabbinic cases of testimony, right? So one question is, if someone gives testimony saying that this happened in the 5th hour and someone else says this happened in the 6th hour, is that contradictory or not? And that the Palestinian and the rabbinic and the Babylonian sources offer different answers to that question, in part because of differing sort of technologies and levels of precision in the way that they thought about how precise you could be with time. I think the hour and its association with a Roman emperor was very prominent in the Roman Empire, and not, as far as I can tell, sort of associated with like Sasanian imperial culture. I could be wrong because I don't know the sources as well, but my sense is that that's sort of more based in the Palestinian sources, and you see that with God's daily schedule, which is in the Babylonian Talmud, but we have these other earlier Palestinian sources. Probably it originated in Palestine and then was moved to Babylon. Yeah.
So you mentioned contacts between Jewish and Christian sources. Do you think that both of them owe something to the Hellenistic influences?
So it's interesting. I mean, first of all, we're talking about the Eastern Roman Empire, right? So these are Greek-speaking, Latin-understanding, Aramaic writers, Hebrew. Like it's a multilingual context. So that's first of all. So really thinking of like fluid communities and traditions. So that sort of, I take for granted that is the case, and you see it in all sorts of ways. It's interesting specifically with thinking about the ordering of time and sort of thinking about how you conduct yourself in the order of the day was like a very thoroughly Roman practice, and it was a practice associated in particular with the Roman sort of philosophical and literary elite. So there's a beautiful new book by James Kerr called The Ordered Day about this topic. And what he argues is sort of the idea of sort of bringing order to the world and to the empire and bringing order to your day were sort of deeply intertwined processes, as was sort of the value of using your time well and not wasting your time. So, for example, the Stoic philosopher Seneca was very concerned about not wasting his time. He writes letters to his friend Lucilius, and he writes them every day, and it's this sort of like daily practice that he has, where he tells Lucilius like what is he doing every day, sort of like accountability for using his time well. Seneca also, in a passage preserved in Augustine, but that quotes Seneca, says like those Jews, like they keep the Sabbath, they waste a seventh of their life to inactivity, right? He was very concerned about wasting time. And so I actually think that sort of the concern with what is God doing with every hour of every day, and is God using time well, and how can we use time well given how we see that God is using time, is actually, it sort of highlights how Roman the rabbis were even when thinking about their God. So I want to sort of sit on the Roman side a little more than the sort of earlier philosophical Hellenistic stuff, but they're all in conversation in these centuries.
So that seems like a good place to pause. Thank you very much for a very interesting and provocative talk. I invite all of you to hear more tomorrow at noon in Nicholson Hall. And I think, Liz, there's a reception outside. Through the back you should go, where we can continue the conversation. So thank you very much.